Hi, it's T with TeaQuilts, and I'm here today to do a quilt block. It's a cross block, and we actually worked on these blocks at my quilt retreat in February, and we did them as optional blocks. So I'm just showing you the picture here of the blocks that we made. I, of course, did not win the block, so therefore I have decided that I want to make the quilt because it's a great stash buster as well. So I was going through a container trying to purge some things and found a container that had some batik scraps that should not have been there, and I don't know why. I had pieces already pre-cut to certain sizes in there. I didn't have a pattern or anything, so maybe I was working on a project and decided that I would just keep the cut pieces that I had left over instead of putting them into my string container or my 2-inch strip container, which is what a lot of them are. So here I have a lot of 2-inch strips, and so that's the perfect size for this cross block. And so what I'm going to do is cut these into 2-inch squares, and then I pulled out some of the red ones so that I can use these as my center. So I found 2 different fabrics, and I only need 1 red square per block, so I will see how many I can cut from 1 fabric or see if I need to do it with 2. So I pulled those out. Those will also be cut into 2.5. Those will also be cut into 2-inch squares. And then I found a lot of light batik squares, different shading. You probably can't see on the camera, but they're different patterns. And so for each block I need 4 2-inch squares, so I thought I'd recut these into 2-inch squares. And then I found a lot of like 16s cuts, and they are like the 9-inch for a quarter cut, and then they cut that into a quarter, so it's a 16th. And so I thought that I would use these to cut my 3.5-inch squares. So I'm going to go do a lot of cutting, and also I will put these cutting instructions at the end of the video. Okay. So I'm at my die cutting area, and I have stacked 10 different fabrics up on my board here. I just have them laid there. With my studio cutter I can cut 10 layers of fabric, so I've stacked them. I only need 4 squares, so I'm only going to cover 4 of the blades and just overlap a little, and then I'll still have any excess I can use in another project. On this, on batiks, it doesn't matter as much that I have the length of grain at my belly button, but if that concerned me, I could definitely turn my board and send it through the cutter this way. But since I'm cutting with batiks, it doesn't really matter as much because they have a tighter weave. So I'm just going to go ahead and run these through. And I'll just bring this back so you can see it. And then I have all of my 4 3.5-inch squares are cut for each set of blocks, so that's 10 blocks there. And then I just use some scissors to cut off the excess, and I can cut this off too. And then I take this and put into my string container, and then I can trash the rest. So it won't take me very long at all to cut these pieces. I have also a 2-inch die as well. So here's what I have cut so far. I have enough for 18 blocks. and now I need to cut some 2-inch squares. When your dies come from TeaQuilt, they are wrapped in saran wrap that's heat sealed. And this particular die is the 50602 for the multiple 2-inch square. And I'll just let you know what the 3-inch number is. For 3-inch finished, it's 50206. So they just have a cover saying it's TeaQuilt, and then they put a piece of cardstock over it. And I just keep those because I can recycle and use that. Now, this is my first time using this die, and I've had it for a while. So this is a reason why you should open your dies, because I have a defect in one of the squares. So I'm not going to cut in that area, or try not to cut in that area. I'm hoping that I can use this area. I can cut 10 layers and just add them up here at the top where I'm not using this particular section for right now, because I don't want to test to see if it's going to work or not. So that's 2, 5, 8, and 2 more is 10. So I'm going to cut 40 squares in one pass here. And I wouldn't normally pull it back. I'm just pulling it back so that the camera can see what I'm doing. I would normally just reverse back and cut from the other side. So that was quick. And I don't necessarily care if these blocks are all matched up in the quilt, because they're all going to be kind of the creamy color. So next I have to cut my strips into 2-inch squares. So I will do that, and then I will come back and show you my next step. I'm back with a lot of my pieces cut. I just placed them into this container. So I have enough to get started, since I'm not trying to cut the whole project at one time or finish the whole project at one time. It's going to be a sew as I go project. So I will take you to my sewing room so we can get started with the sewing. I'm at my sewing area, and I have laid out my cross block, and I'll just go over the pieces that we need again. So you need 1 center square, and I'm keeping it red throughout the quilt, although I may change to a different red if I run out of this particular red. And then you need 4 accent pieces that are also cut 2 inches, and then you need 4 of your muslin, or since I'm using batiks, I am going to use a light batik, and I need 4 of those as well. And then the final fabric that you need is 4 3 1/2 inch squares. So to construct this block, I am just going to sew all 4 of these 2 pairs together, and then I'm going to sew this into a row, and I will repeat that on the opposite side. And then these are already in pairs, and I will just connect it to a center red. Then I'm going to go down and stitch my long rows after I have done that. Now, ideally, if I'm piecing this as a quilt piece as I go, or as I'm working on other projects, I like to just, it's so much easier for me to just sew a light onto the accent square here and not worry about that. So I would never be laying out these blocks until I got all of the pieces in my container sewed a set of pairs together as such. But I'm just going to go ahead and sew a block just so you can see the construction. So first I'm going to do as I said. I'm going to go ahead. So first I'm going to go ahead and sew these together. And then I may go ahead and sew these into rows just so you can see that. So I have my block and I started chain piecing it together. So when I laid out my block, I took my first row here, flipped it over and sewed down, and then I put the red onto this, sewed it, and then I continued down. Then I sewed onto something else, and that's what I'm going to be using my pieces for, so that I can take this whole unit off without disengaging these threads here that's holding it together. And that's just to keep things from being twisted around. It's just a great way of keeping stuff organized. So then I've had this 2 columns sewed, and then I went back and added each piece onto the piece that was already connected. So I can actually take this off and nothing will move. When I did my pressing, I actually finger pressed towards my 3.5-inch corners on the top and bottom, and then on the middle row I finger pressed toward the red. So let me get that a little bit more, because it hasn't been pressed with an iron, so it wants to flip back because batik is a little bit thicker. And then on my 2-piece sets, I just press towards the dark. So I'm going to go ahead and sew these seams together. I like to use pins whenever I want something to match exact. If I don't need to use pins, I normally don't, but at this point I'm working with smaller pieces, so I like to have my seams match up. Just in case something is cut a little weird, especially with me using the die cutter, because if I have a piece of fabric underneath that's not quite as long, then I can go ahead and add that. Make sure I can compensate for that. And I'm just sewing my 1/4-inch seam. And then again, I'm just piecing onto some other pieces in my kit instead of breaking my thread. I find by the time I break my thread, that's wasted thread that I could have used to actually piece a seam. And this is one that I already had on my machine, so I'll just put it to the side, and then I go back and I will now sew the other side. And sometimes I take my pins out, and sometimes I'll just stitch right over them. If you've got fine pins, they don't tend to hit the needle as quickly as, say, one of your thick shafted pins. So you can decide what's best for you on that. So as I said, if I'm just working on other projects and I'm trying not to break my thread, I will just sew a light to any of my accent 2-inch squares, because it doesn't really matter, and they can be scrappy. I really don't care about that. And when you're done, you just press your seams towards your larger square. And I will press this with an iron before I sew them together. But this is my completed block. And I will take a photo of it after it's pressed, and I will add it to this video. But I will also add the photo that I took of the blocks that we had collected at the retreat, so you can see the ones that I had in the photo up close. And I'd like to thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.